The Centre for Human Rights Research is located at the University of Manitoba's Fort Garry campus, which is on the ancestral and continued lands of the Anishinaabe, the Innu, the Anishinaabe, the Ochete-Sakowin, and also on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. All of us in these territories are governed by the promises and the relationships, much of them unfulfilled, of Treaty 1, the first of Canada's numbered treaties, and also of the Manitoba Act. We recognize that those of us in southern Manitoba have benefited from and continue to benefit from colonization, particularly of Treaty 1 lands, but also of the waters of Treaty 3 and the hydroelectric power of Treaty 5 territories. My name is Adele Perry. I am a settler. I am a feminist. I am a mom. I am a historian and a professor at the University of Manitoba, where I teach in the departments of history and in the Women's and Gender Studies program. And it's my real honor to be the director of the Centre for Human Rights Research. Since 2012, the Centre for Human Rights Research at the University of Manitoba has been supporting interdisciplinary and collaborative projects to research and advocate for human rights and Indigenous sovereignties and resurgence. This podcast is called Just Research, and it brings into focus work that researchers, activists, and advocates, and people that are all three, have been doing in their work for social justice. We welcome you to Just Research. In this episode, we look back to the CHRR's long-standing work in questions of water rights and justice with Helen Fallding, the founding manager of the CHRR. Helen also played a key role in the CREATE H2O project. Launched in 2013, the CREATE H2O project used an interdisciplinary approach to explore access to water and sanitation within First Nations communities. In our conversation, we talked to Helen about the CHRR's beginnings in water research, the important role of students in research, and what it takes to have successful and meaningful collaborations in human rights and social justice across a variety of disciplines. Well, thank you for taking the time to have this conversation and help us create this podcast, which we're using as a way to partially think about the history of the Centre for Human Rights Research, and in particular, the H2O and the Right to Clean Water projects. So we wondered if you just wanted to start by maybe telling us a little bit about yourself.
My name is Helen Fallding. I was the first manager of the Centre for Human Rights Research at the University of Manitoba. And I did that job for 10 years, from 2011 to 2021.
And can you tell us about your history with the CHRR? Obviously, your role as the manager, the founding manager, and the manager for a decade. And maybe a little bit about how the center became involved in doing research on water.
So before I came to the University of Manitoba, I was working for the Winnipeg Free Press. And the last job that I did there as a journalist was working on a really big series of stories about First Nations drinking water and sanitation issues. And so when I joined the CHRR at the U of M, the director, Karen Busby, decided that maybe we should do a research project that was related to the work that I had done as a journalist prior to that. She thought it would be a good idea because it could bring in researchers from engineering and all the sciences to work on a human rights project. And the other projects the center were focusing on were more humanities and social sciences. So Karen decided to call a meeting of researchers from across the university who were interested in social justice. And she said, is there anyone who wants to work on the issue of drinking water as a human right in the context of First Nations in Canada? And we expected a couple people to show up, but the room was full. We ran out of seats. There were about 30 researchers there and leaders from Manitoba First Nations organizations. Almost all women, interestingly. So there was a lot of enthusiasm in the room and a really, really wide range of disciplines, academic disciplines that people were professors in. And so we decided to break it down into some subgroups, and we ended up having 3 applications to Canada's 3 main research granting agencies, all of which were successful. So there was a health application, a social sciences application, and a science and engineering application. And out of all that came two main research projects, a social science one and a science one. And the science engineering one was led by Dr. Annemieke Fahrenhorst, who's now U of M's Associate VP. And the social science one was led by Professor Karen Busby in law, who's the director of the center. So we went in two different directions, but we always tried to keep those projects linked to each other and feeding their insights to each other.
That's a really interesting, it's an origin story that I don't think I'd heard before. So it's interesting to kind of hear about the particular way that it kind of came together. So it settled into those two projects that were always kind of in conversation with each other. Can you tell us a little bit more about what those two projects actually did, as far as not just their sort of aspiration and their origins, but what in practice they ended up doing? Because that's always, of course, a little bit different than what we have in mind when we imagine these projects.
So the Science and Engineering Project was designed to train the next generation of water scientists and water engineers who would be actually working in First Nations communities. And the history had been that typically there were non-Indigenous experts who would fly into a First Nation, do something with their water system, fly out, maybe never be seen again. And typically the people doing that work had very little background on First Nations history or working with First Nations, and the communication often didn't go very well. And the water system might break down, and then there was no one to fix it. So what we were trying to do was say, whoever is doing that work in the future should be ideally First Nation themselves, or if not, they should be a non-Indigenous person who's kind of culturally competent at working in First Nation communities. So we recruited a whole lot of students. The focus was on grad students to do research projects in partnership with an individual First Nation. So to identify what the drinking water or sanitation issue was in an individual First Nation, and to form a partnership with that First Nation, ideally, working with one particular person there, maybe the water treatment plant operator, and coming up with a research project that was really practical on the ground about some particular issue that they wanted to solve there. And while these grad students were working on these projects, they were also learning about First Nations history, and they were interacting as, we had about 30% of the students were Indigenous, and the Indigenous and non-Indigenous students were working together, interacting, learning together. And the idea was that in the end, all of those students would go out into the world and be able to work for science and engineering consulting companies and do a better job than previous generations had done. So that was the goal. We had a lot of undergrad students who worked with the grad students, usually as their assistants. So there'd often be a little team of students going into a First Nation. And how that worked out in practice, it was interesting, the projects that came up and the results that came up. One of the things that group of researchers discovered was that a big problem in a lot of First Nations is the underground cisterns that are holding wastewater. And there would often be a place that had their drinking water in an underground cistern and their wastewater in an underground cistern, and both of them would have cracks in them, and there'd be leaks. And what you'd end up with is contamination of bacteria in the drinking water. And some of that bacteria was actually resistant to antibiotics. So that's a pretty dangerous situation to have people in their home drinking bacteria that are antibiotic resistant. So a really practical engineering outcome of that is, those students and the profs they worked with being able to recommend to First Nations future water storage tanks just shouldn't be underground and they shouldn't be concrete. Really practical solution. Other issues that they worked on were In-home water filters, is that a solution in some communities that don't have piped water? And sort of testing how to put them in and how to maintain them and testing whether the water that's coming out of them is really safe. There were also projects with training local people in First Nations to do their own water testing. So they could test the original source of the drinking water, might be a lake or something, and maybe test in their own home. And some of that testing is done by First Nations staff on a regular basis. Some of it's done by the government, but it also, the more people know how to do it, the more you can have a backup test. And if perhaps the government is telling you your water's fine, but you actually have the skills to prove that it's not, and to be able to go back and advocate for better infrastructure. Some of the research was also looking at whether you can use cattails to absorb some of the contaminants that are leaking out of landfills before they end up in a drinking water source. So it was really, really varied, but also really practical, the work that people did in that project. The social science research was broken down into a bunch of different components, but overall the aim was to say, what are the best ways to advocate for improved drinking water and sanitation services in First Nations? And we had law profs, psychology profs, economics profs, all looking at different aspects of that. So, for example, the law professors, we had M.A. Craft, who was looking at Indigenous law around water and what are the principles of Indigenous law that need to inform everything else that you're doing in an advocacy campaign. Professor Karen Busby was looking at legal arguments in international law and Canadian law, and which ones are likely to be most successful if you're putting a case before the courts. Catherine Starzyk was looking at the psychology of why non-Indigenous Canadians either support or don't support improved drinking water systems on First Nations and more funding for that. That was especially interesting research because, it came up with some things that I didn't expect, such as that Canadians who are more patriotic are less likely to support more funding for drinking water on reserves because they feel like their country's already fair. Canada's a great place. It's already fair. It can't really be happening that people are not getting the services they deserve, so I don't want to hear about it. And, on the other hand, she was able to look at strategies that do work, that do appeal to people. For example, if you talk about the effects that poor drinking water have on kids, people are more likely to get engaged with the issue. And Melanie O'Gorman, who's an economist, was looking at what are the economic benefits of actually fixing drinking water services in terms of, if people have what they need at home, they actually have more time to get their kids ready for school and get to work and, all sorts of things in the community start working better when you've got proper drinking water and flush toilets in your house. So all of those projects came together, and every year we would have a conference where people working on all of that research would present their latest results and be able to have those results inform what each other were doing.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting. I went to one of those conferences, one of the water conferences, but probably near the end of the project. So I've got a little bit of a recollection of what that was like. At the time, and I'm thinking a little bit. Those were how what was the general level of, would you say, kind of settler awareness or kind of non-Indigenous folks awareness about questions of kind of water and water insecurity on reserves, including academics, but just in general?
I think there'd been some publicity across Canada about drinking water advisories. So many First Nations across Canada did at that time, and some still do, have drinking water provided to their homes that you can't drink. So you have to, in most cases, you have to boil it or bring in bottled water. And that's, that was sort of happening on First Nations communities. But I think there was very little awareness of the fact that in some First Nations, there wasn't even a tap to turn on. So it wasn't a matter of you turn on the tap and the water that comes out is maybe contaminated. There just wasn't a tap to turn on, and there wasn't a toilet to flush. Some of these communities, people are getting water delivered, or they're actually having to take a bucket to a community tap and haul it back. And the total number of liters of water per day that they're living with in their home is worse than in a refugee camp. I think on the whole, Canadians didn't know about that. And there was a little bit of awareness after the big flu epidemic in 2010 that in the island-like communities in Manitoba, part of the reason the flu spread so rapidly was that people were living in homes without running water. And that was a bit of a shock. A lot of people heard that and they were like, I must have misunderstood that. Like, what do you mean the homes don't have running water? And that flu epidemic was the inspiration for the series of stories that I worked on with the Free Press. And that raised awareness, at least locally in Manitoba. I think still the rest of the country wasn't so aware of that. So I think Canadians knew about contamination, but they didn't know about distribution. That water distribution was actually an issue.
Over the years of the project, what was something that you learned, or maybe to put it a different way, what was something that came as a surprise, and why? Is there one thing that sticks in your mind of all of the many things that you would have learned? What was unexpected?
I didn't realize that sanitation is actually a bigger issue than drinking water. And maybe because it's harder to talk about, people don't like to talk about toilets and what comes out of them. But a bigger issue in terms of health for people is what's happening to the water that's being flushed out of your house, if it's being flushed out. And if you, for example, are relying on an outhouse, what's happening with that? That's more likely to affect your health and also less likely to get the attention and funding that it needs.
Yeah, and often those things have been inseparable, like changes to water kind of infrastructure is always going along with changes to sort of sewer and other kinds of things, and tend to kind of be. But I think part of it is that water can be kind of like bad water supply can be kind of quote unquote fixed by delivery of bottles of water. It doesn't actually, because it still has the labor issues. It still has all of the time. It still has all of that. But in a way that the sanitation is such a thing that can't be kind of like remediate. There's no Band-Aid in a sense.
Right. There's no 5-minute solution.
Yeah, exactly.
Going to the store and buying a bunch of water. Yeah.
Looking back now that it's a fair bit the rearview mirror, what do you think the biggest contributions of that project was? If you had to pick one thing, you can pick more than one, but if you have to
I'll pick a few.
Starting with one.
I think the biggest contribution and the thing I'm most proud of being, involved with is the grad students who left the CREATE H2O program, the science and engineering program, and went on to do important work. They got jobs in engineering firms and environmental consulting firms and working directly for First Nations. And, they're doing great work in the community. And from what I can see, they really are very authentically engaged with the First Nations they're working with. And they know how to do it. Their heart is in it. And I think they're teaching the people around them how to work in partnership with First Nations. So that feels like a real success, that it really worked. And I think an awful lot of it was just the Indigenous and non-Indigenous students working together on the ground and hanging out together a lot.
What would you describe also kind of in retrospect as the biggest and most persistent challenge to doing the research that the center undertook? What was the hardest thing?
I think for all of the professors who were doing the research, it was really hard for them to find the time to build and maintain really strong collaboration with First Nations. So, professors tend to be overworked and they're going in a million directions at the same time. It is a different workload than a normal, quote, normal research project to be co-designing research with a First Nation and negotiating along the way all the changes in the research and what you want to do with the results. That is an ongoing, very satisfying kind of workload, but it takes a lot of time. And, the challenge was for, I think, especially some of the science and engineering profs, they didn't have the background in community engaged research that social scientists might have. And so for them, it was learning how to do it and also finding the time to really do it, not just try to delegate that to somebody else. You have to be, if you were the lead researcher on a project, you have to have some kind of relationship with, for example, the chief or one of the counselors, where you're able to pick up the phone and chat with them in an ongoing way. You can't just have your grad student try to do that or your research manager try to do it. You have to do it yourself. So if you're doing that kind of work, you have to be prepared to put in that time.
Absolutely.
Another challenge was designing research grants in a way that you'd get funding for community-based assistance.
Yeah.
Because, when you're sending a bunch of University of Manitoba students onto a First Nation, you actually need somebody who lives there, who can join the research team and, be collecting samples and leading you to the best water sources and all that kind of thing. And we would find those people, but we should have been able to pay them. And sometimes we could, and sometimes we couldn't. So you're asking people to be part of your research team. They need to be compensated for that time. And research granting agencies are a little iffy on whether they want to fund those kinds of positions, because they like to fund professors and they like to fund university students, and they don't always like to fund somebody who's in the community, not tied to a program of study. So that's an ongoing thing. We need to keep encouraging, where it does work, to keep encouraging funding agencies to do more of that and to consider that part of the normal process.
Yeah, absolutely.
And and also one thing that was interesting for me was how many students there are who are interested in doing this kind of work. That we were able to, we thought there weren't that many Indigenous students enrolled in science and engineering. So we set a target of 20% Indigenous students in the H2O project, and we're able to get 30%. So it's, there are students out there, when you can provide them with the opportunities, provide them with the stipends, provide them with the training, there are a lot of students who are interested, and there are also non-Indigenous students who are interested and maybe have more flexible minds in their youth in terms of being able to really learn a new way of doing research.
Yeah, and I think the point about having systems, both in terms of funding programs, but also in terms of sort of university processes that support those kinds of ways of doing research, I think is an ongoing challenge, and one that it's good to realize how long it has been a challenge for, but how I think it still really remains something that we haven't cracked the code on, and something that institutions and funding agencies need to do a lot of work on if we are to make research relevant to the people to it matters the most to.
So it's, I think of universities are sometimes involved in kind of legal aid work, and that's an interesting model where people, you set up a center, people come to you with your problems and you help them solve them. And maybe that could be extended way beyond the legal arena in terms of First Nations research. It also reminds me, one of the other challenges was consistently working across faculties and across disciplines. And there are all sorts of structural barriers to doing that. I think human rights issues are big issues that require a lot of different brains from a lot of different disciplines to come together to actually have any hope of solving them. The engineering department by itself it's not going to solve issues, and neither is the psychology department by itself. But to get people to work together, you have to overcome researchers' own reluctance to delve into something in another field, but you also have to overcome all the structural barriers. You want a little bit of funding, but the department head's going, well, it's not really a psychology project, so why should I be helping fund something that's related to history? And there aren't, internally in the university, there aren't those pots of money that are not tied to departments. So we were just constantly running up against these barriers. And I think on every level, the university should be facilitating interdisciplinary, interfaculty research.
Well, this new project that we have that we're just sort of embarking on is very much kind of set up around that. And I think one of the things that we're really trying to keep in mind is that a big part of it is also just the researchers learning, both from each other, but also, from communities, from wider context. But that itself has to kind of be part of the work, because there are such wildly different ideas of what research is, what good research is, what effective research is, and that in a way, requires some kind of pretty deliberative kind of labor to get people to be able to have points of conversation and points of connection.
And I think it also requires humility. And I think that's the key word in terms of non-Indigenous researchers working on First Nations research. You have to go in assuming that you don't know very much and that you're going to make a lot of mistakes and that you have way more to learn than you have to teach. And I think that's not the standard position that academics come from.
Yes, I think that is absolutely the case. And then in how this also kind of fits with the other kind of moving parts that are going on as well. But that is very much not what academic training leads people to very often. And I think we have an awful lot to learn.
And I think academic training also rewards individual success and getting credit for your work. And so it really sets people up to be lone wolf researchers, which just doesn't work in this kind of a context.
Absolutely. So there's a whole lot of kind of relearning and reworking that needs to happen at kind of multiple levels. Yeah, for sure.
And when you start this work with grad students, if they learn how to work in teams right from that level, then they're more likely when they go on to academic positions to already have those skills. So that's part of what I liked watching in the process of this project.
And I think that is something that the science-based disciplines do have as more part of the sense that is what the training is that you are learning to kind of work with others and to kind of co-produce, sometimes in very unequal ways that don't necessarily have the values, I think, that we might want about, that come out of kind of feminism and decolonization. But I think those of us who come from disciplines like my own, as a historian, I do think you are really rewarded for your ability to shut the door and get to your own work. That's a super good skill to have. And then suddenly there's this expectation, because I think people are realizing that research that has the widest application and kind of the meaning over the longest term is often done in really kind of collaborative and conversational ways. And that's a very different skill set. So,
and I think it's
interesting.
I think it's also really interesting to bridge the science, social science divide there, because the science and engineering professors, I think, learned about the kinds of social skills and even historical analysis that their students needed to make the communication work. with First Nations. So, more of a sense of these students might have picked science as what they were good at, but they also had to be good at a whole bunch of other things to make it work. And I think it also doesn't hurt for students in humanities and social sciences, to spend a bit of time doing that really practical stuff. Like take them out on a water sampling mission in a First Nation to get grounded in like what's really going on and what's the practical problem we have to solve here. And you can bring your social science mind to how to solve it, but always keep grounded in we're actually trying to make a very practical difference so that somebody can turn on a tap, have clean water, and get on with their day.
Yeah. And I think what is common kind of, or what cuts across different disciplines also, we tend not to think about very much. And one thing that I always think is like the number of people, and it's not me because I have an undergraduate degree in history and women's and gender studies, but a lot of people end up doing both history and biology or some relationship to it. And I've taught a lot of students who also, and I think there is this common kind of observation. And there's like the habit of observation and kind of categorization as a kind of a disciplinary skill of what you do. Look, take whatever the material is, and the material is different, but there is this sort of practice that actually cuts across those ways of thinking and the ways of seeing the world. Maybe
yeah, so I think
more to be done.
So I think going forward, it would continue to be interesting to, for example, pair a science and a non-science student together on a project and have them watch the way each other's minds work when they're confronted with the same issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. If a group was going to sort of begin a project that was related to sort of water, Indigenous people today, tomorrow, next week, what would you advise them? What would be your first sort of suggestion that they might want to consider?
I think for these kind of projects to be successful, there needs to be Indigenous co-leadership right from the get-go. And, you may be, let's say you want to do an engineering research project with a First Nation, and your department might not have any First Nations engineers available to co-lead that with you. You need to be looking further afield and finding somebody, like maybe the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs has someone with some engineering background who you can partner with, or maybe someone in another province. But you really need to have at the very top, deciding whether this project is worth doing and applying for funding and designing it. You need to have that Indigenous leadership, or you're just bound to go off in a well-meaning but not very helpful direction.
I mean, it's an interesting reflection, too, on questions about sort of indigenizing the academy as well. And I guess I wonder if you have any thoughts about those questions in light of these projects.
Well, I think of some of the grad students who came out of this program, and I'm very proud of the work that they're doing right now on the ground. But I also hope that some of them will end up coming back into academia, and some of them were pursuing PhDs already. Some of the master's students might do that in the future, and that they will end up as researchers, profs back in the academy, being able to next time around lead the project, instead of reporting to a non-Indigenous professor. Like, we need to keep going in that direction to say, what we did in 2012 was not bad for 2012, but a generation later, you can do something that's got a lot more direction from First Nations.
Yeah, for sure. If you had all the time and all the resources in the world, and you were, had all these questions before you, what would be the initiatives that you would have liked to have seen those researchers and those folks who are undertaking that work at the time take on? Were there things that you didn't get to that you would, in retrospect, you would have liked to? If there are things that you thought about getting to that you never just kind of were able to get around to?
it would be great to have some kind of ongoing academic hub where that First Nations can come to with water issues and just say, this is the thing that we're struggling with. Do you have somebody who could take it on? And, could you line me up with a grad student who could work on this? And just to be, I think the University of Manitoba has become known for this kind of research. So there'd be more First Nations who've heard of one of their neighboring First Nations who's maybe worked on a project, and they would think, well, we could use something ourselves as well. And I think the challenge there is always from the academic end, it has to be research focused. And research focused and solving the problem are not always exactly the same thing. they can overlap sometimes, but if there's a way to make those two things work together, I think that would be interesting. Within the academy, we don't really know exactly what the problems are, and what we're guessing they are is usually not quite what they are.
Yeah, absolutely. So some kind of ongoing way that those sorts of connections and that problem solving can occur. Well, those were all of the questions that we had. I don't know if there's any questions you have or things you wanted to mention that we didn't get to.
I think a real key to the success of the CREATE H2O science engineering project was Wendy Ross, who was hired as the research manager for that. So she was there for most of the 5 years that it ran. And because she's someone who spent part of her growing up time on reserve, she was a First Nations member herself. She had worked in previous jobs in First Nations communities, for First Nations communities. She was kind of like the heart of that program. All the students, used her as a mentor. She brought them together. She was able to deliver a lot of the cultural components of the program. And I think, because the program was run by a non-Indigenous professor, it was just so crucial to have Wendy there. And I don't think it would have worked in at all the same way without her.
Throughout our conversations with Helen, we learned that interdisciplinary collaboration in research is no easy feat. However, it is important to do the work across disciplinary lines, and especially in collaboration with First Nations communities. It is in these collaborations that projects like CREATE H2O produce valuable insights and change. Today, these questions of water rights and justice emerge within the interdisciplinary and collaborative work of the Just Waters Project. To learn more about this ongoing project, you can visit our website, chrr.info. We'd like to thank Helen Fallding for taking the time to talk to us on this episode of Just Research. This podcast was produced by the CHRR's Knowledge Mobilization Coordinator, Angela Ciceron. And similar to the other initiatives of the Center for Human Rights Research, it benefited tremendously from the knowledge and the work and the acumen of Dr. Pauline Tennant. We'd also like to thank Michael Elves and the UMFM team for their support and guidance for this podcast.